Hello and welcome to Season 8 of Bad Gays, a brand new season. My name's Hugh Levy. I'm a writer and author.
And I'm Ben Miller, a writer and historian currently at work on a biography of the fashion designer Rudy Gernreich. It's Season 8 of our show, Hugh.
Very excited to be back.
How did we do 80 hours already of this?
Yeah, it's been a labor of love, I think.
It's absolutely a labor of love, and a labor of love that we can only perform thanks to those of you who subscribe to our monthly show, Extra Bad Gays. So if you've missed us terribly and don't want to miss us again after your 10 normal Season 8 episodes come out, then take a look at Extra Bad Gays. Subscribe if you feel like it. But let's get right to it, shall we? Because we've got a lot to cover today, Hugh.
Yeah, I'm really excited. So who are we covering on our first episode?
Well, today's episode, Hugh, is about someone we've had on our long list for a long time and on our short list several times. And it's one of these stories where we've tried a few times to pull together the threads, but we keep getting lost in the foothills of our own ignorance, right?
Right.
You and I both have our own language skills. We have our own knowledge bases. In some cases, they're enough to take us into something resembling original research. But in a lot of cases, we run into languages we don't speak, sources that we're not familiar with, and we need historians and journalists who've already done the work. So since just about the first season, I think, we've been tantalized by stories of the Burmese gangster Olive Yang.
Oh, great.
The tale just seems so juicy. In the two English language profiles we were able to find of Yang back then, both by the journalist Gabrielle Paluch, we found unbelievable biographical details. Here was a lesbian, possibly transmasculine gangster, born royal in 1927 British colonial Burma, who, when first married off to a man, threw a pot of her own piss at him to prevent the marriage from being consummated.
Did that work?
They ran away. Well, we'll find out.
Okay.
They ran away from polite society, dated actresses, ran opium, were involved with the CIA, and helped negotiate settlements between warring ethnic groups. And when they died, reported Paluch in the New York Times, they were being kept in a compound by still loyal soldiers who planned a massive funeral to honor their departed leader. But we kept running into a wall of sorts as we approached the Yang story. A lot of the most interesting claims were hard to source. Fact was difficult to distinguish from fiction. And everything kept going back to sources we couldn't access, both because we don't have the budget to fly to Myanmar to access archives, and frankly, we wouldn't know where to find them or how to read them even if someone did send us there. And it's precisely this theme of truth and fiction, maybe a little bit like in our Elagabalus episode last season, right, where salacious stories about sex and power become an important part of statecraft, that Gabrielle Paluch takes up in the book that she very helpfully for us published last year about Yang, which is called The Opium Queen, The Untold Story of the Rebel Who Ruled the Golden Triangle.
Okay.
So this is going to be one of our book review episodes. Just like with Ahebi of Babe last season, we're really depending on someone with more subject area and language knowledge to help us tell this story. Just like with that episode, we really hope that anyone who finds this episode fun or engaging checks out Paluch's book, either buys it or checks it out at their local library. Paluch writes, quote, "This is the story of how secrets about Olive Yang took on a life of their own against the backdrop of an important theater of the United States Cold War against China. This is also a story of propaganda and lies, and what truths they reflect back to us." End quote. We know from our previous episodes, right, that Western colonization had a tremendous impact on shaping sexuality both abroad and at home.
Mm-hmm.
And we also know from our previous episodes that the Cold War in the West was linked to scandals that linked same-sex sexuality to the communist threat.
Mm-hmm.
Yang's story helps us break open those same themes from the other side. A brief note on gendering. I'm going to they Olive Yang throughout this entire episode, and I'm going to do that despite the fact that Yang did not. As in our Joe Carstairs episode, I'm doing this to draw attention to a question rather than to indicate that the question is solved.
Right.
Yang was assigned female at birth. They spoke languages that mostly did not use gender pronouns. They were referred to by family using female gender pronouns in English, but they preferred to be referred to as uncle in the local language, which was not common for women. They is a way here for us to highlight some of the potential ambiguity that exists when we think about people who emerged out of different sex gender systems. I don't think the she that Paluch uses is wrong. I certainly don't want to convey the idea that Yang existed inside a contemporary non-binary subjectivity. They certainly did not. So the story of Olive Yang begins with geography. The Shan Plateau is located in the east of present-day Myanmar, east of the cities of Mandalay and Tongyi. The land rises rapidly out of the valleys to an average elevation of 600 to 900 meters, or 2,000 to 3,000 feet. Mountain ranges that run through this plateau add an additional 1,000 to 2,000 meters, or 3,000 to 6,000 feet.
Okay.
In the valleys of the plateau, rice is farmed. In the northern part of the plateau, gems are regularly discovered. This is complex, sort of rutted, hilly, misty land, and extremely difficult land to control from the outside.
Right, it sounds like, yeah.
In his history, The Art of Not Being Governed, James C. Scott refers to the Shan Plateau as part of what he calls Zomia, which is an upland rugged region the size of Europe that's located inside several state territories in Southeast Asia. Scott writes, quote, Zomia is the largest remaining region of the world whose peoples have not yet been fully incorporated into nation-states. Hill peoples are best understood as runaway, fugitive, maroon communities who have, over the course of 2 millennia, been fleeing the oppressions of state-making projects in the valleys: slavery, conscription, taxes, corvée labor, epidemics, and warfare. Virtually everything about these people's livelihoods, social organization, ideology, and, more controversially, even their largely oral cultures, can be read as strategic positionings designed to keep the state at arm's length. Their physical dispersion in rugged terrain, their mobility, their cropping practices, their kinship structure, their pliable ethnic identities, and their devotion to prophetic millenarian leaders serve to avoid incorporation into states and to prevent states from springing up among them. End quote.
Oh, that's really interesting.
But after 1945, Scott writes, these areas began to be subsumed into state control, and this is because of what he calls distance-demolishing technologies, right? These are things like railroads, paved roads, telecommunication, and aircraft. They do something that Scott calls diminishing the friction of terrain, right? You can make a phone call up to see what's going on in a village. You don't have to trek up the mountain.
Right, yeah, previously it would have taken 2 weeks on the back of a horse or donkey, and now you can fly within hours.
With a helicopter, exactly, and land right there.
And so time
exactly
is shrunk.
And this helps add new character to any analysis of Yang's life as a sort of anti-heroic folk bandit who was constantly engaging with different imperial powers like the US and Britain, with local regimes in Myanmar and Burma, and with different regimes in China, both communist and anti-communist. Kokang, which is the specific part of the Shan Plateau where Yang is from, is in the northernmost part of Shan. It shares a border with mainland China and is actually still part of the official territorial claim of the Republic of China on Taiwan.
Okay.
Its people, like Yang, are predominantly ethnically Chinese. In 1927, this region, when Olive was born, was on the unsteady border of a British colony and a Chinese republic that was being rocked by instability and waves of revolution. Throughout Yang's life, this region would become a front line in the Second World War, fought between Britain and Japan, then a British colony on the edge of the Iron Curtain, then an independent state, one ruled by communist and then by military dictatorship. And another thing about Kokang is this: if many parts of the Shan Plateau have flat enough areas to grow rice on, Kokang's land is essentially perfectly suited only to one crop, a very different crop, opium.
Now I get to it.
So even today, Paluch writes, Kokang is a place where, quote, the Burmese military pits rebels against one another in competition for control of lucrative resource concessions like teak, jade, and also illicit narcotics. Rebel armies who sign ceasefire agreements with the government enrich the generals, who turn a blind eye to their illicit trade and then crack down on them when it was convenient, end quote. Olive Yang was born into a royal family in Kokang in 1927. Paluch begins many of her chapters with italicized recountings of the more fanciful legends about Olive Yang, the ones that were maybe formatted to fit your screen. So let's say some things that do not appear to have been true about Olive Yang's childhood. They do not appear to have started smoking cigarettes as a toddler. They do not appear to have learned how to shoot before learning how to read. And they do not appear to have fought off the attendants who were supposed to bind their feet by shooting them off with a gun in each hand and a cigarette dangling between their lips.
But these were all stories that were told about Olive Yang and therefore can tell us something at the very least about how they were perceived.
Yes, and they all make wonderful mental images.
Yeah.
Olive Yang was born into a family that was profoundly steeped in both traditional and gendered hierarchy. They were known as second sister, naming their place and gender within the rank of children. This was a home in which the women ate after the men, but both were attended to by many servants. Olive was a member of the 8th generation of the Yang family, and a traditional faith healer, a geomancer, had actually foreseen an end to their dynasty after that generation. Olive's own father had to fight off a pretender to the throne by appealing to the British governor. Their older brother died at the age of 10, which cut off the family line. Olive's mother suspected that it was poison and reacted by banishing a large proportion of the family.
Oh, wow.
This was a family that made its wealth through opium trading. Everyone in Kokang gave 1/5 of their opium crop to the Yangs as taxes, and additionally the Yangs were the only people who were allowed to legally export it. Nice work if you can get it.
Right. So it's a sort of protection racket.
It was a feudal system.
Okay.
So yes, I mean, in that feudalism is a protection racket, but
Yeah.
the porous boundaries between feudalism and gangsterism, I think we'll see throughout this episode. It sort of depends who's calling you what.
Sure.
Since the region had been settled by non-indigenous people, both of Burmese and Chinese ethnicity, the Yangs had built power as a family that was able to negotiate between different rulers and regimes. Starting in the early 19th century, opium exports from British colonies into China exploded. This was an intentional imperial response to Britain's trade deficit with China.
The Opium Wars.
Yes, well, we're going to get to the Opium Wars, but yes. It started with Britain intentionally exporting lots of opium to China because they wanted to reverse a trade imbalance because Britain liked tea and pottery.
And China didn't want anything that Britain produced.
And China didn't want anything that Britain produced, right.
They weren't importing our beans on toast.
There are some food items, Hugh, that during our book tour, you were just happily promoting to me that I still am haunted by to this day. But anyway, I live in Germany, so joke's on me. This created an addiction crisis in China, and the Qing dynasty then governing China responded by attempting to crack down on the trade. The British then invaded China in 1840 through Hong Kong, Canton, and Nanjing. A treaty signed in 1842 ended this war, and it ceded Hong Kong to the British, and it also gave Britain most favored nation trading status with China. What I think is really interesting is that even some recent imperial histories glowingly describe the actions of the British here as a defense of the principles of free trade. And I think that really does give the game away as to what free trade is and who it benefits.
And it was a very targeted attempt to derail the Chinese economy also through addiction.
Yes, absolutely. You could solve two problems at once. One was your trade deficit with China, and the second was here is this place, China, which does not want to integrate into this other world system developing here on the other side of the world, which is building power. And so how do you destabilize this other place and how do you sort of push them down?
And they attempt to sort of undo the very complex system of Chinese bureaucracy that allowed them to run such an impressive empire.
And that also made China a very closed system at that point.
Right.
China was not particularly interested in going to Europe or going anywhere else. They wanted to stay in China and have China. It was big enough.
We talked about this a bit in the episode on Gordon of Khartoum and just the sheer scale of the devastation that it wrought on Chinese society. And just in terms of numbers, you're talking about over 100 million dead, I think.
Absolutely. Just from addiction, right? And yeah, I mean, these are some of the trade institutions that evolved into what we now euphemistically call the rules-based international order, right? Rules-based international order intensifies. A second round of wars in the 1850s opened up more of China to foreign traders and formally legalized opium in China. They were forced to. They did not want to.
Yeah.
Burma itself had been governed by a series of Buddhist dynasties since the days of the Pagan Kingdom, which is a kingdom of fabulous riches that began in the 1100s. A syncretic mix of indigenous religions and Buddhism created a society based around temples. 3,000 to 4,000 temples were built, of which hundreds, which are buildings of exquisite beauty, still dot the landscape of present-day Myanmar. Many people go to Myanmar to look at the Pagan temples. Burma became the intellectual center of Theravada Buddhism. Later dynasties culminated in the Alangpaya dynasty, which went from 1752 to 1885. Most of these centralized states, however, were centered in that flat southern part of the country. Hilly regions like Kokang were more or less exempt from state power. 3 Anglo-Burmese wars began around the same time the Opium Wars began, and they culminated with the invasion of Burma in 1886 and its conversion into a province of British India. The monarchy and the monkhood, which were dynastic Burma's 2 main sources of governance, were destroyed by the British. There was guerrilla warfare, which originated in many upland provinces which fought back against British control, and the British responded with mass atrocities, village burnings, and ethnic cleansing. The Yang family made deals with the British colonial officer responsible for their region, which helped convince a weakened China to formally cede that region to British Burma in 1897. That officer's name was James Scott. I am presuming that there's no relation to the James Scott who wrote about Zomia, but you never know. So here's a story that is true. A young Olive, 4 or 5 years old, wandered into a dinner of assembled local leaders and started absent-mindedly playing with a gun that one of them had left on a table, and the resulting gunfire nearly killed several of the guests. Olive responded by laughing. Impressed, their father gave them a pistol and a pony, and they learned to ride and shoot at a young age. By 6, Olive's mother wanted to raise them in a more traditionally feminine fashion and insisted on binding their feet. Olive did resist, but their feet were broken by the procedure and remained small throughout their life. They began school at the age of 10. They were sent to a Catholic missionary school and received the name Olive after Santa Oliva of Palermo in Sicily. The missionary was run by Milanese nuns. They preferred pants to skirts, smoked, and when they were bullied by other students, responded by showing the other students the gun they kept in their school bag, and so were summarily expelled and sent to Kunming in China, where they stayed with relatives who were part of the anti-communist elite there. Probably a good thing that they were out of Burma in 1942 when Japan invaded Burma brutally. This was a reign of destruction, of murder, of arson. There was a mute servant who had been left behind to guard the Yang palace while the family went into hiding. And that servant wouldn't tell the Japanese where the family was because that servant was mute and was burned alive for that refusal.
God.
The family was in hiding, as I said. Yang's father helped coordinate a resistance in alliance with Chiang Kai-shek. U.S. intelligence got involved and provided spies who helped cooperate with local tribal forces. Supplies were airlifted in, and as was typical of the region, Kokang never really fell under full Japanese control.
Mm-hmm.
But Olive wasn't there, right? For the war, Olive was spending their time in the relative safety of Kunming. And it was there that they first fell for a woman named Jean. Jean was Scottish, but had been born in China to missionary parents and spoke Chinese. Olive was sad when their brother came to pick them up and take them home, and was even sadder when their brother fell for the same woman and brought Jean home with him as his wife. The 3 of them returned to a Kokang that had been destroyed by the war. Olive had been promised to the son of a nearby family. The Yangs and this other family had regularly intermarried to keep local peace for generations. The wedding took place just as Burma declared independence. The Yangs were declared the local lords of their state. Olive was furious about their wedding and their brother's wedding, and apparently their family knew they were in love with Jean and knew that they were disgusted by the idea of having sex with a man. Their mother had to bribe them to go through the wedding with pistols.
Wow.
Now, this was a time when a Burmese noble bride was apparently expected to resist sex all the way through to physical resistance. Marriage was a staged abduction. Olive took this to new lengths. They instructed palace guards to shoot their husband, who was a habitual opium smoker, if they ever saw him smoking. Olive's husband was under legal pressure to consummate the marriage. The law was that if no heir was produced within 5 years, the marriage was annulled. So Olive's goal was to remain a virgin for 5 years,
Right.
and then they could get out of it. trigger warning here for sexual violence. Olive's husband enlisted the help of one of their aunts who had guards catch them, take away their guns, and lock them in a room with their husband, who then raped them. When the room was opened again, the husband was discovered bleeding and soaked in urine, but had consummated the marriage.
That's horrific.
It is horrific. They did, in fact, become pregnant, but as soon as they realized that, they snuck off, abandoned the family, abandoned the husband, to bear the child in secret and to help some local thugs fight off the communist threat from across the border. Now, why were they suddenly able to flee? Well, their father's death had given them a bit more freedom. Now, this was a decision that made their family and their society understand them as an ungrateful demon, right? Someone who preferred the company of bandits to their own family and child. We might have a more sympathetic understanding, right? Someone who wanted to escape what was essentially the threat of continued violent marital rape. Olive gave birth at the end of 1950 to a son that they named Jeep. This might seem like an insulting name, but Olive just loved Jeeps. They refused to breastfeed their son. The son was raised by nursemaids. The son is alive. Gabrielle Paluch found the son. The story of how they found the son and what the son said is amazing. It's in the book. We're going to leave the son to the side for all of this. At this time, Olive began to cut their hair short, to bind their breasts, to dress in fatigues, and began to gather men to join anti-communist forces that were being pledged American weapons and support by the newly formed CIA. In February of 1951, the CIA started shipping weapons to Burma, and the idea was to use Burma as a staging point to launch an invasion of China. The theory was that if the Kuomintang, Chiang Kai-shek's anti-communist forces invaded, the people would immediately rise up and join them.
Right.
Well, they didn't. The invasion was a failure. Hundreds of troops died. No progress was made. Olive and their men became a crucial component of local resistance to communist invasion, though, because Kokang was still somewhat disputed territory, right? And if you've got a hilly region where people are trying to launch invasions from your neighbor, you might want that too, right?
And this is in Southeast Asia, is the sort of period where they had this thing called the domino theory, right? Which was that they were scared that if one country fell to communism, there was a sort of bulwark of these nations against the threat from China, which is, one of the reasons why America poured so much of its military resources into the war in Vietnam.
Yes.
And so this is a story that's repeated, I guess, across that whole region of local militias, as well as bandits and drug dealers and opposition forces, etc., all being funded by the Americans in order to try and limit the spread of communism within Southeast Asia.
Yeah. And what you'll see is that Olive and their allies are extremely ideologically flexible, let's just say.
Right.
Olive's younger brother, Edward, had taken over after their father died. Edward was off in Rangoon in Parliament, and so Olive commanded the local toughs, and they ended up fearing and respecting them more than their brother. Olive and their men claimed opium and sometimes rice and cattle as land taxes, much as their family had, but this time with slightly less formal methods. So to quote Paluch's book, quote, "Villagers were being robbed, eggs were disappearing, all of the misbehaving levies were under her command. Olive had been using Edward's officers for her own errands, collecting taxes without permission. Some villagers even claimed their sons were being forced into joining the army for secret missions along the border with China," end quote. Olive began running the opium down to Thailand in exchange for weapons, which were then flown back up by a white man named, name alert, Dutch Brongersma. Further south on the Shan Plateau, the CIA started funding an institution with the spectacular name, the Anti-Communist Anti-Soviet University of Yunnan Province. And this began training students in anti-communist ideology and as guerrilla fighters. The plan was, through this guerrilla force called the Secret Army, to establish a Chinese-speaking anti-communist territory in Burma, using opium money and U.S. weapons, and then to use this as a base to launch guerrilla attacks and to destabilize and then eventually to invade and destroy Red China. So these border regions became hotbeds of trade, of banditry, and of smuggling. Actually, Burma was a major source for the Chinese communists as well of goods, and so Olive and her gangsters would sell to them, but they would do things like hide contraband in sacks of rice, cut flour with laxatives, like break things before selling it to them. Yang pretended to be a double agent for the communists, but was lying to the communists and would report back on their bases to the anti-communist overlords.
Wow.
And then on top of all of this, Olive and their gangsters identified some precious metals mines. So business was good. But in 1952, Olive went to jail. These insurgents may have been supported from the outside, but the first Burmese government didn't want to be so involved in trying to overthrow its much larger neighbor.
Yeah.
So they were arrested at a border checkpoint. They were sent to a high-security prison suspected of the crime of collusion with insurgents. And the Burmese army began to invade Kokang to eliminate the secret guerrilla army. That secret army and its brutality, and actually Olive by name, were condemned unanimously in a UN Security Council resolution in 1953.
Wow. So they were significant as a force.
They were. Now in prison, Olive was known as a bit of a seducer. So much so that perhaps with some bribes thrown in, they managed to be released rather quickly. And they ended up setting themselves up in a 2-story house in Mandalay with a woman named Da Te Te, who was the warden of their prison. Now, according to Olive's sister Judy, Da had a special gift made for her lover, which was a leather belt with an attached teak dildo.
Wow, nice.
And
teak
Jeep,
strap-ons.
a teak strap-on, yeah. Hopefully no splinters. Jeep was actually sent to live with the two of them, but Olive wasn't satisfied with just Da. They also reportedly seduced the movie star and actress Wawa Winshui, who's still alive and who, when asked by Gabrielle Paluch, angrily rejected the idea that she had been in a relationship with Olive Yang. But Judy, one of Olive's sisters, reported that Wawa had actually been deeded the house by Yang.
Wow.
By 1956, Kokang was once again identified by the CIA as a potential base for launching anti-communist activity. Under the pretense and maybe the genuine fear of a Chinese communist takeover, they began funding something called the New Life Movement, and Olive became a bandit for these forces. I want to quote James C. Scott here again, because I think it's an interesting quote as we think about collaboration with these different larger outside powers, right? Quote, "What relatively autonomous hill peoples have historically faced, however, are the ominous choices forced on them by approaching state power. This might mean the choice between enslavement and headlong flight, between the loss of direct control of their communities or subsistence activities in open revolt, between forced sedentarization and breaking up and scattering." Olive also became infamous after a British judge named, name alert, Gerard Sparrow, wrote a sensational account of his time in Burma called Opium Venture, which promulgated the vision of Olive as a sort of hypersexual Eastern seductress, a kind of opium babe with knives in her hands, a sort of imaginary, like Bond girl type temptress. Let me quote from the book jacket description of Opium Venture. Quote, "Known throughout the Far East as the notorious Salem Princess, she trafficked in opium, the black gold that grips the hearts and minds of millions. Young, lovely, and cruel, she was a despot, ruling hundreds of men by the whip, the drug, and her panther-like beauty. Sent from Bangkok to the Shan states on the borders of Burma to investigate her activities, Judge Sparrow tells the fantastic story of how he tamed the dangerous charmer and got away unharmed, haunted forever by the savage personality of that proud and passionate woman."
a Burma-sploitation novel.
A Burma-sploitation novel, and nothing could be farther from the truth, right? This was not at all Olive Yang's presentation. Olive Yang was not this kind of hyper-sexualized, hyper-feminized, Bond girl seductress with, watch out because there's a knife in there.
Yeah.
It's
And
such a reflection
They were more like
of
a sort of Che Guevara figure.
Exactly. Well, it's
presentation.
like anti-communist Che Guevara figure,
Yeah.
but yeah, they were a guerrilla. They were walking around in military fatigues.
Yeah.
Which, some people may be very into, but it's certainly not this kind of like, it's the kind of writing where as you read it, you just hear that like horrible, like racist Hollywood movie gong in the background and like, pentatonic music and, it's. So in real life, what Olive was doing at this time was not seducing Gerard Sparrow, but recruiting more people to join this paramilitary organization. People were fleeing the Great Leap Forward, which, sorry, Tankies, was actually terrible, into this border region. And there they joined a lot of families who would rather sign on with the descendant of their former local ruler than with the new army of either of two new and possibly untrustworthy states. Burma, as a state, proposed first alongside a kind of developmentalist line and then later through a military dictatorship that called itself socialism, the military regime that renamed the country Myanmar and that we know now maybe from the genocide it's committing against Muslims, against the Rohingya, and for its years-long imprisonment of Aung San Suu Kyi, right? This new state wanted to get rid of local lords, wanted to crack down on minority languages, and wanted especially to break these local regions' control over their local police and their local taxes.
Right.
And they also wanted to criminalize opium. The Chinese government was also trying to take over this region. They ended up offering incentives for Olive's brother to abdicate. They offered Edward a big pension to just give up. But Edward decided to fight, and Olive was very much in favor of fighting. Alongside neighboring Kachin leaders, a rebel army of 5,500 soldiers was formed, which fought for the rights of Chinese citizens in Burma, but against the communist takeover, and also the right to continue exporting opium. They continued to trade opium for guns and weapons, and they did a lot of their gun trading at a hospital in northwestern Laos, which was run by Thomas Dooley, who was an American doctor, and he funded his hospital in two ways. One of them was by raising funds from Catholic donors with, beautifully written sob stories about all of the impoverished Laotians who he was healing and, introducing to Jesus, and also from the CIA, for whom he was running a gun smuggling operation. But the CIA had a gun to his neck because they knew that he'd been kicked out of the Navy for homosexual activity.
I knew I recognized the name. He's on the long list somewhere.
Yep. So, amongst all of this, a wave of chaotic violence sweeps the region. Burnings, beheadings, famines. All sides are guilty. Eventually, in 1960, the border was negotiated and finalized. Olive and the Yangs were to lose some of their opium-growing territory, but the majority of Kokang stayed inside the borders of Burma. The U.S. made attempts to withdraw the secret army, but many of them disguised themselves as refugees, hung back, and then rejoined new CIA secret anti-communist paramilitaries in Vietnam. So as you were saying, these anti-communist reactionary guerrilla paramilitaries funded by the U.S. are sort of constantly moving back and forth and up and down and between different states.
Yeah, that's interesting, moving across states. And also, it seems to be very much based as much on pragmatism as on ideology.
Certainly. Now, back in Rangoon, Olive decided that they wanted to marry Wawa. They gave Wawa a ring and deeded them into the house. Family said, can't marry another woman. Olive said, well, I'm going to try. And a judge refused. Despite the fact that the family had lost some of their opium territory, business was booming. A military coup had placed Burma onto a harsh, restrictive road to socialism. Again, as I said, the same military junta that people are familiar with now. But Kokang was still relatively loosely governed. The Yangs had a legal cap of opium they were allowed to export, but they were able also to smuggle lots out over the legal cap. But it couldn't last, and Olive was arrested again. Brutally raped in prison, they had nothing to do but sit idly by as their brothers were arrested and deported, and the junta then took full control over Kokang. And the war on drugs, which began globally in the early 1970s, only intensified repression and brought the end of the Yang regime in Kokang. So the necromancer's prediction that the 8th generation would see the end of their control over the area was actually true.
Wow.
So after Olive's release from prison, they led a mostly quiet life as a local merchant and warlord. But then, in 1989, in their 60s, they were recruited to help negotiate peace agreements with a rebel force. Even in 1989, statecraft in Kokang remained a dodgy and difficult affair. Negotiated settlements with local opium growers were necessary to exercise state power. And in March of 1989, the local branch of the Communist Party split off and formed something called the Myanmar National Democratic Alliance Army. This local head, Pham Kashin, was related to the Yang family by marriage and was deeply involved in opium trading. The Yang family established a company called the Peace Myanmar Group. This is still a running concern in Myanmar. It's a beverage distributor, but it is suspected of being a way to launder illegal opium profits into the legitimate economy. I can't say that it is, but
it's a strange right turn from
Paluch,
opium smuggler to
Paluch
soft drink
seems
dispenser.
to Paluch reports that many people suspect is
Right.
what I can say fully. And because Olive was known to all parties, known to the state and also known to Fung, Olive became one of the brokers of peace. And only months after its creation, the MNDAA signed a peace treaty with the Burmese junta, which gave it control over Kokang as the Shan State Special Region 1. Opium trading was effectively legalized in this region and led to a big boom, and it became kind of a narco state within a state that existed in peace with the national government until 2009. In 2009, the Burmese junta insisted, in a very anti-Zomia way, that the different ethnic militias, like the MNDAA, be integrated into a single unified border guard force that would be under national control. And this led then to clashes. The Burmese army this time won. 30,000 refugees fled across the border to China. And in a really odd reversal that shows just how flexible and non-ideological a lot of these alliances are, the Chinese Communist Party at this point was now supporting the MNDAA against the Burmese state.
Right.
A 2015 attempt by the MNDAA to take Kokang back from the Myanmar army failed, and sporadic violence continues into the present. Gabrielle Paluch was only able to piece together this complex story through a whole lot of on-the-ground journalism and building trust with sources. She spoke to Jeep, Yang's son. She spoke to Yang's sisters. She spoke to Wawa. Paluch spent a lot of time in Myanmar working in media there. It's a wonderful book and a very fun to read one, and I really do recommend it, even now that you know the kind of overview of the story. I had a lot of fun with it.
I'm sure there's a lot of color in there, yeah.
There is, and I want to now read Paluch's description of perhaps the most astonishing thing that she did, which was meet Olive Yang.
Oh, wow.
So this was in 2015. Quote, "Rising up out of the valley near Lashio into the hills adorned with pagodas, I frequently passed caravan traders on bikes, operating the same routes Olive had once operated. For the last leg of the journey, I hired a car to better cope with the steep climbs. Judy had given me directions to what she called a cow company. Eventually, I came upon a cattle depot behind a Chinese-style white-tiled compound, and the car was directed to enter through a gate. As far as I knew, I was entering the home of a livestock exporter. In fact, the cattle depot was Duan's disguised militia headquarters. I gathered myself, got out of the car, and as soon as I looked up, there Olive was in a wheelchair on the porch overlooking a large open yard. That's the moment they realized an American had breached the compound." End quote. So there's some discussion about the fact this has been set up and this has been agreed, and so they roll Olive back out. So back to the Paluch text. Quote, "Olive was frail and tiny, wearing a jade necklace and smoking a cigarette, smiling contently as the surrounding commotion unfolded. Judy says hello. She's the one who told me about you," I explained. "I'm a journalist and I'd like to write about your life. Is that okay?" "Many people have written about me," Olive said, apparently confused by the question. "What do you want to say?" "I wanted to know," I began, trying to find the right words to ask. "How should I respectfully call you?" "Please," Olive said, "call me Uncle." End quote. And then the men decide that the interview can't happen, and that's the extent of it.
Oh, no.
But it's kind of an amazing story.
Yeah.
So that brings us to the end of the story. The final thing that I wanted to add to this conversation is a final quote from James Scott about the nature of hill societies like Kokang and like the Shan, right? Quote, "The first thing that strikes any observer of hill societies is their bewildering linguistic and social complexity over comparatively small distances. On a stop-action snapshot that freezes the historical flux, it is diversity that seems to dominate the scene. All the valley powers, from the classical states to the colonial regimes to the U.S. Special Forces, the CIA, and the Burmese ruling junta today have exploited these differences for their own purposes. Hill peoples are not pre-anything. In fact, they are better understood as post-irrigated rice, post-sedentary, post-subject, and perhaps even post-literate. They represent, in the longue durée, a reactive and purposeful statelessness of peoples who have adapted to a world of states while remaining outside their firm grasp." And that's the end of the story of Olive Yang.
Hi, you're listening to Bad Gays. We're an audience-supported show. We don't have a network, we don't have sponsors or advertising. It's really you guys who keep the show on the road. So if you're interested in supporting us, why not head over to Patreon, where you can listen to Extra Bad Gays, our monthly podcast about all things queer.
It's really fun to do. You get to hear from us every month. You get to hear from us in a less scripted format. We're starting to do fun new things like an advice column segment. Again, all of that is only for subscribers. You can also subscribe on Apple Podcasts right there in the app. We also have new merch for season 8. We have t-shirts. We have socks that say Evil Twink Energy on them. We have caps in pink and camo and black. Go check it out, all at our website at badgayspod.com. All of that helps us keep the show going and do more of this, which we love to do.
And now, on with the show. Thanks, Ben. Fascinating story, as always. I imagine almost all of our listeners would have had no idea of this amazing person. Their lifespan is really interesting because it sort of covers such a significant change in, 20th century ideological and sort of governing systems of that area. I guess there's no such thing as like a sort of fixed culture or society in anywhere. And especially there, like these hill cultures and communities had always been changing, it's what you're saying, and sort of shifting in relationship to power. How have they changed sort of in the period of her life, do you think?
Well, one thing I want to do is to not over-orientalize here.
Yeah.
Like, I do think that this is a very different place, but also think about 1927 to 2017, where we're from.
Oh, of course.
Right?
Yeah.
Like, there's this great line. I don't know if anyone has seen the TV show Mad Men, but there's a secretary who is in her 70s who passes away in about 1960. And they're struggling to write her obituary. And the Bert Cooper, the character, comes in the room and says, Ida Blankenship was born in 1895 in a pigsty in Pennsylvania, and she died on the 28th floor of a skyscraper in Manhattan. She was an astronaut.
Yeah.
Right? Like, from 1927 to 2017... my grandmother was born in 1931. She's still alive. You think about the changes in sex gender systems, in power dynamics that she lived through, right? While never leaving the Boston, Massachusetts area, and there were no revolutions.
Right. I mean,
it's still a lot.
My grandmother died in 2017 as well. And when she was born, Tsar Nicholas was the emperor of all Russia.
Right. That being said, I think Yang is in a place that has a huge amount of change. That's really one of the front lines of big H history during the time that they're alive. And so I do think one of the things that I think is interesting about this story, right, in addition to all of the, amazing gossip and anecdotes, is seeing how these kinds of exercises of power that can often seem extremely abstract actually work themselves out on local people, right? One of the things that our show is opposed to is the idea that queer history should be made up of either noble resistors of power or noble sufferers under it, right? We all know that some people make accommodations, that some people collaborate, that some people do all sorts of things, right? And there's no particular reason why queer people shouldn't do those things too. And we see in the figure of Olive someone whose sex gender position makes them in a way uniquely interested in seeking this particular kind of life, right? On the one hand, they emerge from a feudal family that has already been collecting a portion of everyone's opium as taxes, and so moving into a kind of banditry that's also very much based off of this historic family connection to the land, right? Like everyone knows who they are, right? Makes sense in that way. And then the urgent need to escape marriage, right, also makes them sort of set out for it, right? It seems to be a good match in a way between someone's natural kind of predilections, right? Someone who's very much not afraid of guns and violence, and someone who is very traditionally interested in traditionally masculine kind of cowboy-like behavior, and a moment in which there's money to be made in that and an escape from the strictures of normative life to be found in that. And to be more specific about what we mean by the strictures of normative life, we're talking about the executed threat of continued marital rape, right? Like that is what they were running away from, and that really is something to be running away from.
Right.
That would not have been a one-time thing. And we see how brutal it must have been for the evidence of resistance to have been so extreme, right?
Yeah, I mean, to escape brutal situations often requires a sort of internal brutality of one's own.
Right. There's this, that suffering and experiencing horror does not make people better. It just makes people have experienced suffering and horror.
Yeah, that's very true. How do you think that Olive felt about their girlfriends? Is there sort of much personal details about how they regard themselves and especially their gender in relationship with these other women?
Yeah. I mean, from what we know, it's hard to speculate too much, but Olive seems to have been, if we want to adopt a kind of lesbian approach to this, a butch in some butch femme dynamics, the story of
that's who they were attracted to.
The story, yep, seemingly the story of Olive is someone who cut their hair short, right? Who bound their breasts, who dressed in military fatigues, and who was attracted to first Jean, this kind of glamorous redheaded Scottish woman, and then to the prison warden, but maybe that was just a way of getting out of jail, and then to this movie star and actress, right? So, and the story of the dildo maybe also brings us to the idea that Olive might have been a top, but that might be applying too many of our own categories to the past, and that's certainly speculation.
A teak dildo, though, is that's a really good present.
It is a really good present, although I would be worried about splintering.
Oh, no, because it's a hardwood.
Right, I guess it wouldn't.
Yeah. So bearing that in mind, I could probably know the answer to this question, but Olive Yang, good gay, bad gay, good, not gay, bad, not gay.
Well,
taking into account all the normal caveats we have from the Yeezys.
Exactly. Phrases. So, if we're using gay in the broadest possible sense, right, instead of a gay, not queer, not gay way, definitely gay. I mean, as for good or bad, I think absolutely bad. I think bad in a number of senses, right? Bad in the sense of probably responsible for some atrocities. Bad in the sense of, rejected by their own family and understood as this kind of bandit who abandoned duty and honor in order to pursue this sort of wild life, right? Bad in the eyes of a society that constructed them in all of these crazy ways with all these crazy stories, from the Burmese epithet Miss Hairy Legs all the way through to this sort of Bond girl depiction in that nauseating British judge's book. But a fascinating person, I think, who definitely deserves our attention and who it was really fun to get to know a little bit to convey this episode.
Yeah, really fascinating. So in terms of sources, I mean, I want to borrow this book once you're, now you're done with it. I'm guessing this was the main source, but I'm wondering if people have any more and want to read
This was the main source, and I filled it out with that James Scott book, The Art of Not Being Governed, a really interesting book for anyone interested in kind of anarchist state and political theory and history. And then, frankly, the Encyclopedia Britannica entry for Burma has a fascinating and extremely well fact-checked history of that country, a map of its geography, and was very helpful in terms of putting together where and how all of this was cited and where it took place. Well, that's our show. You can find me on Blue Sky at benwritesthings.bluesky.social or on Instagram at benwritesthings or on the web at benwritesthings.com.
And you can find me on the web, hugh.substack.com.
And until next week, bye.
Bye.
Bad. 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 Gays. Bad gays.